Okay, our next speaker is Mary Hunsicker from the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, and she's going to be talking about indicators of a marine ecosystem shifts.
Thank you. First, thank you to the workshop organizers for inviting me to be here today. I'm really excited to be able to present some of my research to all of you, and thanks to all of you for staying here for the last talk of the workshop. So I have a lot of collaborators who have been involved in the work that I'm going to be presenting, and I couldn't fit them all on the title slide, so I'm going to save my acknowledgments for the end of the talk. Much of the work that I'm going to be talking about today is based on a large multi-institutional, multidisciplinary project called the Ocean Tipping Points Project. And this is a collaborative project with researchers from the University of California at Santa Barbara, scientists from NOAA, from Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions, from the Environmental Defense Fund, and from and also involves many other management and research partners. And to start, I'd like to provide a definition of what we mean by ocean tipping points. The definition provided by this project is when large incremental changes in human use or environmental conditions can result in large and sometimes abrupt changes in ecosystem structure, function, and benefits to people. And these tipping points can arise through multiple forms. For example, they can arise when there's a linear relationship between drivers and the response variables, but the underlying dynamic exhibits threshold behavior that is tracked by the ecosystem response. They also occur when the relationships between the driver and response variables is nonlinear. And often they occur when there are hysteresis conditions, which means that the relationship between the driver and response variable is different before and after the shift. And it's in these cases that it can be very difficult to recover to your original ecosystem state. As Phil Boyd pointed out earlier this morning, there are a large number of examples of regime shifts or tipping points in marine ecosystems. This map here shows approximately 100 examples of where tipping points have occurred across the globe. The colored dots here indicate different types of habitats and illustrates that these tipping points have occurred in reef systems, coral reefs, rocky reefs, also kelp forest systems, pelagic systems, salt marshes, seagrasses, pelagic systems, etc. And also, as Phil pointed out, there continue to be a growing number of examples of regime shifts or tipping points in marine systems. This paper, which documents climate-driven regime shifts on a kelp forest ecosystem in Australia, just came out in Science a couple weeks ago. So knowing that these tipping points can have negative consequences for human livelihoods and well-being, and they can persist for quite a while, and they can be difficult to reverse, two of the main goals of this Ocean Tipping Points project have been to improve knowledge and understanding of ocean tipping points, their potential impacts and their relevance to management, and also to work with management and research partners to co-develop and disseminate a toolbox of approaches for managing ecosystems that may be prone to tipping points. And for the remainder of the talk, I'd just like to highlight some research projects that my colleagues and I have been working on that address some of these overarching goals. The focus of these projects include identifying the prevalence of strong nonlinearities in marine ecosystems, developing a framework to identify ecological thresholds, and testing the utility of early warning indicators of abrupt change in marine ecosystems. So for the first project, my colleagues and I were interested in taking a closer look at some of the drivers that are driving regime shifts in some of those examples that I showed you in the map. And so we developed a study in which the larger objectives were to better understand the relationships between single stressors and ecosystem components, to identify when nonlinearities and thresholds, and to identify when these nonlinearities and thresholds are likely to exist. And our motivation for doing this, we had several reasons for doing this. First, because ecosystems are complex and often we don't know what the relationships are between drivers and responses. A default assumption can often be that the relationships are linear. However, if there can be some high social and economic and ecological costs associated with this assumption if indeed those relationships are nonlinear and exhibit threshold behavior. In addition, if we can get a better understanding of the single stressor response relationships, we may be able to help inform when and where multiple stressors interact and how we might be able to manage for these interactions, which can be quite difficult to do. And lastly, if we can get an understanding of these relationships and potentially quantify thresholds that exist in those relationships, we can use this information to inform reference points or safe zones for managing marine systems. So our approach for accomplishing some of these objectives was a meta-analysis type of approach where we conducted a wide literature search to collect papers in which the authors looked at both linear and nonlinear relationships. And once we had a large pool of relevant papers, we then narrowed down the pool based on a few selection criteria. For example, they had to be a field study in a pelagic marine ecosystems. The authors must have used statistical analyses to identify the relationships between stressors and responses. And we only kept those relationships that were deemed significant based on p-values or model selection, unless we could actually extract data from the papers or from the authors and fit models to those data ourselves. So all in all, we had 75 papers in our database and about 728 relationships. So then to be able to quantify, well, what's the degree of nonlinearity in those nonlinear relationships, we used published or derived estimates of effective degrees of freedom from generalized additive models, which are essentially nonlinear statistical models. And we used this as our measure of a degree of freedom. So for example, with an EDF of 1, it indicates that the relationships are linear. An EDF between 1 and 2 indicates that they're weakly nonlinear. And an EDF greater than 2 and higher indicates that they're increasingly nonlinear. So here are just some examples of the metrics that were used in the studies that were the independent or explanatory variables. We went ahead and we grouped these metrics into larger groupings of driver stressors to help interpret some general patterns. So we have climate, exploitation, pollution, and food web. And then now looking at the ecological responses, this just provides some of the examples that were found in the published studies. They ranged from individual level to population level to community level responses. And the trophic levels of the organisms for which we were able to collect information range from higher trophic levels, including seabirds and sea lions, down to lower trophic levels, including plankton and planktivores. And here are just some examples of what the data look like. These just show examples of relationships between drivers and stressors within those major groupings, including climate, exploitation, pollution, and food web. So just to highlight some of the key results that came out of this, this figure here shows the percentage of linear and nonlinear relationships that came out based on the published literature. And quite surprisingly, they were pretty much equal across all of our large groupings. So the gray indicates linear relationships, and the blue indicates these nonlinear relationships. And then when I parsed out these nonlinear relationships based on my estimated, my estimated degrees of nonlinearity, you see that those relationships that were nonlinear often are these highly nonlinear relationships, which are likely to show inflection points and might have detectable thresholds that can inform target setting. So these dark blue are the highly nonlinear relationships, the pale blue are weakly nonlinear, and the really light blue are those that were nonlinear, but we couldn't actually quantify the degree of nonlinearity. One concern that I had when I was doing this meta-analysis is that the methodologies that authors use to identify relationships between stressors and responses are not always consistent. And so I then narrowed down the pool of papers those that I considered to be the most robust from a statistical standpoint. So the authors had to provide some evidence that they were actually looking for both linear or nonlinear relationships. And so what I found was that when I looked at these robust set of papers, there was an increase in the percentage of nonlinearities in those papers. And in addition, there's an increase in the percentage of highly nonlinear relationships that I found. And so what this indicates to me is that we could possibly be underestimating the prevalence of these strong nonlinear relationships in our ecosystems, but that potentially with advances in statistical methods and accessibility to these methods, we might actually see an increase of evidence of these nonlinearities with the future research. As I mentioned, one of my interests of my colleagues was then to quantify thresholds in these driver-response relationships and to see if we could come up with some general patterns of these thresholds in these relationships. One example of this comes from a study from Philippe Curie et al., where these authors, based on a global meta-analysis, identified threshold effects of prey abundance on seabird breeding success. This is showing thresholds shown here in this figure. And what they found is that roughly 1/3 of unfished forage fish biomass is needed to support seabird breeding success. And so they use this as sort of a rule of, it could be a potential rule of thumb for management of marine systems and for seabirds, protecting seabirds. However, one challenge that we had in our study was that we found that most threshold analyses have been used to to identify thresholds in ecological time series data rather than driver-response relationships. For example, only 8 papers of our 75 actually quantified stressors in single response relationships. And so this precluded us from making some generalizations about where these thresholds are likely to exist. However, soon after I completed that project, 2 colleagues of mine from the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, Jamil Samhiri and Kelly Andrews, hosted a workshop in Seattle that brought together NOAA scientists from around the country who are interested in this idea of trying to quantify these ecosystem thresholds, to come together and to develop a generalized framework for identifying thresholds that we could then take back to our own systems, our own study systems, and also to share with others who are interested in similar questions and doing something similar. And for this paper that we are writing based on this workshop, we really were focusing particularly on identifying ecosystem thresholds for environmental drivers and human activities in the California current ecosystem, the ecosystem states, the human pressures, and the environmental pressure indicators came from time series from the California Current Integrated Ecosystem Assessment, which is a tool to help support ecosystem-based management. And so in doing so, we're hoping that the information that we learn from the study can actually be useful or useful in a management context. And this slide is just to remind me that one way that we are trying to identify these thresholds and threshold regions is to calculate second derivatives in these nonlinear response curves. Okay, so the remainder of the talk, I'd like to talk about some work on leading indicators of ecosystem shifts. So because citizen transitions can have large impacts on ecosystem components and ecosystem services, there's been a lot of interest in developing early warning signs of ecosystem transitions so that we can anticipate the change and potentially mitigate the ecological and economic impacts of those transitions. One example of how ecologists are trying to identify these leading indicators comes from a paper by Kendra Carr and her co-authors. And what they did was they collected data or analyzed data from a bunch of different coral reefs across the Caribbean to see if they could actually find indicators of tipping points in these coral reef systems. One of my colleagues has referred to coral reefs as the poster children, as coral reefs as poster children for ecosystem tipping points. In the Caribbean here, many of you may know that there have been large ecosystem shifts from coral-dominated to macroalgal-dominated systems, reef systems, due to multiple stressors, including the removal of herbivorous fishes due to exploitation. And so in their study, they used total fish biomass as a proxy of the effect of fishing pressure on coral reefs. And they looked at how 7 different indicators of reef health changed over a spectrum of fish biomass levels. And what they found generally is that there was a sequence of changes where thresholds for some of these indicators occurred at higher biomass levels than thresholds of other indicators. And so generally what they found, for example, for macroalgal cover, in invertebrate fishes, and fish species biomass, they may be leading indicators of changes in reef health compared to other indicators such as coral reef, which could be potentially a lagging indicator of reef health. I'd also like to talk to you a little bit about a different type of early warning indicator, and these are based on statistical properties of the data, and they're called generic early warning indicators. These metric-based indicators are based on complex systems theory of critical transitions and alternative stable states, and in particular, they're related to this phenomenon of critical slowing down in population recovery from perturbations as resilience declines and a critical transition approaches. And this illustration from Mooters et al., I think, demonstrates this idea quite nicely. So the figure on the left illustrates an ecosystem variable that is highly resilient and is far from a critical transition, whereas the figure on the right indicates an ecosystem variable that is less resilient and closer to a tipping point or critical transition. And what we see is that as the ecosystem variable becomes less resilient and approaches this transition, it shows higher variability and becomes more correlated either spatially or temporally. And it's this rise in autocorrelation or variance or some other statistical metrics that lead up to this transition that serve as this early warning indicator of an approaching shift. Now, past work in model systems, laboratory systems, closed systems such as lakes indicate that these early warning signals could potentially be a useful management tool. However, their utility has only recently been assessed in marine ecosystems. And I'll just show you some of examples of some empirical applications of the early warning signals. This, again, comes from the study by Wooters et al., where they found a rise in temporal variability prior to a regime shift in the North Sea. So looking at data going back to about 40 years of data going back to the 1970s, they looked at autocorrelation in phytoplankton and diatom abundance, as well as standard deviation in phytoplankton and diatom abundance. And the large regime shift occurred around in the late 1980s. And so what they found was a rise in both the autocorrelation and the standard deviation leading up to this regime shift in most of these cases. One of my colleagues, Mike Litzow, and some of his authors published a study where they found rising spatial variability in catches of crustaceans up to 4 years prior to a collapse. Mike and some similar group of co-authors also documented rising variability in cod prey abundance ratios accompanying the reorganization of 2 continental shelf systems. This includes the Gulf of Alaska and the Scotian Shelf, where we have observed changes from a crustacean-dominated community to a cod-dominated community in the Gulf of Alaska following a large climate regime shift there, and a shift from cod-dominated to crustacean-dominated in the Scotian Shelf, largely due to overfishing. And again, another example comes from the Arctic, where the authors have found a rise in variability in Arctic sea ice extent prior to acceleration and loss rate of sea ice there. So although we do see some successful empirical applications of these early warning signals to marine systems, there's also several examples where they have not worked. And so Mike Litzow and I were then interested in trying to conduct an analysis of why do we see some of these mixed results. And so we basically conducted, again, a meta-analysis to identify the factors distinguishing successful and unsuccessful applications of early warning signals in field studies, using both published studies and some new analyses from the Northeast Pacific. And one of the key points that came out of this meta-analysis is that those analyses that are able to demonstrate nonlinearity in ecosystem dynamics are more likely to support these theoretical early warning signal predictions than studies that show linear or undetermined dynamics. So for instance, if we go back to this study that I showed before by Mike Litzow, where they documented the shift from a crustacean-dominated to a cod-dominated system, here's the time series of predator-prey ratios and sea surface temperatures, which is thought to be the main driver of the shift in the species composition. And when we look at plot the sea surface temperature against the predator-prey ratios, we see evidence of a nonlinear relationship that exhibits hysteresis. So the relationship between sea surface temperature and predator-prey ratios is different before and after that climate regime shift, which was driven by the changes in the PDO. An unsuccessful example of the application of early warning signals comes from coho salmon in the Northeast Pacific in the California current system. Salmon are known to have a strong response to the Pacific decadal oscillation here, and they also show a response pretty quickly, usually like within a year or so. And here's showing the time series of salmon abundance anomalies dating back to the 1950s, and then this red line here indicates significant breaks in that time series. And these breaks line up very nicely with shifts in the PDO from warm to cold or cold to warm periods. However, when we looked at plot the relationship between the PDO and these abundance anomalies, we see strong nonlinear relationship and not the nonlinear relationship. We don't see evidence of nonlinear relationships or hysteresis. So in moving forward, a key take-home message from this work is that testing for nonlinear dynamics or signs of hysteresis is a key step for improving field studies of early warning signals and hastening the testing and application of this promising idea for management. My co-authors and I have, or colleagues and I have received some funding to provide more tests of early warning signals in California current, Gulf of Alaska, and the Bering Sea. One sort of limitation to this test is that it really requires long time series, and a lot of the ecological time series that we have are often short and often noisy. So it sort of limits our ability to sort of test these in some of these different systems. So just to sum up, the work presented here, indicates that nonlinearities are common in open ocean ecosystems, where these nonlinearities nonlinearities do exist, they tend to be strongly nonlinear and thus could have detectable thresholds for informing reference points for management. Nonlinearities may also be systematically underestimated in our marine systems. We might see more evidence with advancements and increased accessibility to some sophisticated statistical methods. In terms of the early warning signals, they are promising, but they definitely need more testing in ocean systems. I think with more advances in statistical methods and also modeling scenarios that can account for regime shifts and potentially do a good job of forecasting regime shifts, we might actually be able to do a better job managing nonlinear ecological change in our ocean ecosystems. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge a large group of collaborators on this work, coming from different institutions. It's a pleasure to work with this really great group of scientists. And if you are interested in learning anything more about some of the products coming out of this larger Ocean Tipping Points project, I encourage you to check out this website. And with that, thanks for your attention.
Questions for Mary? No?
Are there any examples of uses of these methods for management? Say, okay, we see a tipping point coming, we need to close this fishery, or has it gotten that far yet?
No, it hasn't. At least to the best of my knowledge, I haven't seen that yet. There are within the ecosystem-based management framework and this integrated ecosystem assessment, they do have these indicators, ecological indicators that are sensitive to ecosystem changes that they monitor, but not so much in the context of tipping points. That hasn't really happened yet. But there are some scientists from NOAA who have been trying to have actually published in papers where they're incorporating regime shift theory into ecosystem-based management framework to try to move that ball forward a bit.
Any other questions? Okay, let's thank Mary. And we have a short Q&A session. If we can invite all four speakers to come down for a short Q&A.